Yes, I think in terms of looking at what are some of the commonalities between all of the stories that we've been hearing and all of the practices, I think the way Maya has been put together, looking at it from a learning perspective, I think it incorporates some rather critical things. One is that it creates essentially a liberating structure. So it's using that term and using it, I'm actually borrowing that word from Bill Torbert, but liberating structure in the sense that it is both it's one that actually produces generative learning, people coming to understand things through a very different kind of perspective, and that perspective has to do with who they are, and then that changes the way they view the world and their experiences, and at the same time is simultaneously productive, and by productive meaning that it leads to changes. It leads to change outside. It leads to activities being changed in a positive way. Another thing that really strikes me is the holistic nature of it, whether it's defined that way or not, that it's not just cognitively thinking, but it's also experientially connecting in the affective dimension. And I think that's a very important thing in terms of people taking action. I think it's a lot easier to be able to come up with a rationale for not taking action when, even though you see what might be the injustice or the need for action, but you can come up with a rationale for, well, now's not the time, whatever. But when you have an experiential connection to it, it's a lot more difficult, it's a lot more challenging to do that. And I think that incorporates into the space. The other thing that I think is evident in all of these stories that we heard is that what the approach that's being taken does is it puts in place a scaffolding, and it's the rigor of having to go through this process. So the hourly check-in, that's what I mean by the scaffolding. It's not so easy. How many people in the room have often thought, well, they would like to engage in this kind of activity, maybe go to meditation, maybe go to something else, and every other day, every week they don't do it. But this idea of being put in place until they actually experience it, I don't think Maya is something that you can teach in the traditional way that we use that word here. It only comes clear when people have had the personal experience to it. I was also struck by all of the stories, including the ones that we just heard from our colleagues elsewhere, of how initially they were skeptical. Initially it was like, well, all right, I'll go through this, it's convenient, and many of the folks here said that. And it was only when they experienced it that they suddenly caught on. And one of my sort of, crazy analogies, but a story is when I was involved with an action research project one time, several years back now, but it had some academics on it, also practitioners from the organization. One of the practitioners was a organizational psychologist at another university who was well-intended. He was in it because it was an opportunity to do research, whatever. I was supposed to foster reflection and dialogue at certain points, and at one point in one of our first meetings, he said, I actually stopped him and said, now it's time to do a reflection and dialogue, and they all went through the process quite well, and it moved the conversation forward. And he even came up to me afterward and said, oh, that worked well. Well, it was about a year later into the project, and I can say this because he's actually said this in public and we've actually put it in an article. It was about a year later he came up to me at one of our meetings and he said, Lyle, you remember when we did that first reflection? And he said, there's one thing that I didn't share with you that time. I was thinking, you know what, we're already behind schedule on this project, now we got to do this shit. But what actually had come to him over the time was through the experience. At this point, I can be perfectly honest, he's better at that than I am. I mean, it's changed the way he teaches his courses. It changes the way he actually engages in these sorts of practices all the time. But what happened was it was actually the experience of it that had him turn the point. And I think what's also built into this whole initiative is the idea that people as they experience them themselves, and then being encouraged to actually take this back to their other countries, to their other settings. It's actually dealing with one of the things that's often missing in higher education, which is actually facilitating the process of transfer of learning. How do you transfer this into another stage? And I think that's critical for any kind of a movement going forward. And I think those elements are built into the process. And it'll be very interesting to watch how it all unfolds. And the underlying assumption being that everybody is always interconnected. And once people start to realize that, it changes the way they interact. It's the system and understanding the other in a way that you feel it, not just think about it. So.